Welcome back to the Network of Networks workshop at SESYNC. Our next session is called Existing Models and Inspiring New Networks of Networks. For this session, we have two speakers, and we'll focus on existing models, common and unique challenges, and best practices across disciplines. Our first speaker is Dr. Leslie Reese, Assistant Professor, Department of Biology, Georgetown University. Dr. Reese is a macrosystems ecologist who studies how large-scale changes in climate and land use impact biological communities with a focus on butterflies. As part of her research program, she leads the North American Butterfly Monitoring Network, which provides support, outreach, and opportunities for collaboration to people involved in the collection, curation, and use of North American butterfly monitoring data. She is also a member of a new global consortium, Butterfly Net. Leslie was a research fellow at SESYNC for 4 years before moving to Georgetown in 2015. Welcome, Leslie.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's great to be back at SESYNC. I'm going to be talking about some of the network that I work with, but in particular one that was started right here when I was at SESYNC and through some of the support that they gave me. I was not familiar with AccelNet, although it's been great to hear about it, and I'd like to learn more. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really from the perspective of a tenure track research professor. Because I hear a lot of you in this room, you're actually the head of a network, you work for an institution, you have the ability and the institutional support to hopefully support your network. But a lot of times when you're coming in as a professor, there are a lot of challenges that have to do with the fact that supporting and being in a network is not necessarily part of the role of the professor. A lot of times your administrators don't understand the different challenges that are coming at you. So what I'm going to be talking about is really some vignettes that touch on some of the topics that have already been brought up and that many of the people in this room are already going to be familiar with. So especially speaking to people who are thinking of starting networks and some of the challenges and rewards. So as was already said, I study global change. I'm a global change biologist, but I lead a network of butterfly monitoring networks. And just to give you a little history of why I do that is when I first really wanted to get into this the research of looking at global change and impacts on butterflies in particular, I realized that there were a lot of citizen science groups out there monitoring butterflies, but that most of them did not have the functional capacity to manage or share their data. And so I had to decide, do I want to play that role or do I want to shift literally to a different research topic? And so I made the decision, back when I was a postdoc, that I wanted to try to take this on. And again, I actually had a history working actually in customer service, which I think, made me somewhat suited to do this work. So I was able to start this network, again, here at SESYNC, and I want to share a little bit about why I think that project was successful, especially in light of some of the challenges that often come. So first of all, I had just received funding to start a big infrastructure to support certain types of butterfly monitoring. Although interestingly, that initial grant from NSF, I was told specifically, we don't think you should try to start this network of regional butterfly monitoring groups because we don't think that you can get them to agree on the things that they need to agree on. So that's just too high risk. Don't do that. And when I came to SESYNC, I said, I want to try to do this anyway, and I was able to get a lot of support. And the interesting thing, I think, is that most of these groups are started by museums or butterfly houses. It is a different culture than academic culture. And when the academic world tries to come together with these citizen science groups, sometimes there's a clash of cultures. And the interesting thing about this is almost all of the sort of difficult issues revolved around disagreements about taxonomy. And I only bring that up because it's an easy thing to dismiss, like who cares about taxonomy? But these people really cared. And I honestly think that the reason that I was ultimately successful in bringing these groups together, getting a shared vision, and developing a system that supported all of them by having them all come in and, in this initial meeting we had in 2012, right here at SESYNC, is that I realized that I had to tell them right from the get-go, you can use any taxonomic authority that you want. And honestly, that is still one of the things that has kept this group being super friendly with each other. It's a really positive group. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these networks. So the network that I'm talking about is the North American Butterfly Monitoring Network. It has a sister group of networks that monitor specifically the monarch butterfly. And I want to make a slight distinction between people that maybe take a picture and upload it to iNaturalist. That's a type of citizen science. But these are all networks of people doing structured surveys. So it is a network of networks. So like the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Michigan Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Texas Butterfly Monitoring Network are groups that recruit volunteers to go out, set up permanent transects, and survey those transects. I also work with this group ButterflyNet that I'll talk a little bit about, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about this group called CUBES, which is a network of people trying to bring data and math into the undergraduate biology curriculum. So I actually work with lots of different networks. I've worked with an international network of butterfly monitoring networks throughout Europe, and that has led me to want to start a new network of people looking at global climate change and butterflies in Mediterranean ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because this is an aspirational network, something that I'm thinking of putting together right now. And I'm just going to share a little bit about some of the things that I think about going into this network. So first of all, the reason I'm even able to potentially put this network together is because I've become so entrenched in the sort of global network of groups that monitor butterflies. And I know that world very well, and everybody knows me as well. And the reason I focused in on Mediterranean systems here is for two reasons. One, many of the global hotspots are in Mediterranean systems, and also, for whatever reason, there are a lot of these butterfly monitoring networks that use very similar protocols in these systems, and I don't know if so we've got the longest running network since 1972 in Northern California. We've got a network that's been running since 2011 in Southern California, one in Catalonia that's been running since 1996, and one in Israel, actually, that also came to the original meeting here in 2012 that's been running since 2009, and one that's recently started in South Africa. And even though there's not a formal butterfly monitoring network, there's such a great history of collecting this natural history information in Australia that we could potentially pull in this Australian group as well. And, for my research goals, the reason this is so beneficial is I'm really interested in developing general mechanistic models. And by working across multiple systems, you're forced to try to figure out what's the difference and what's the same about the system. And so from my perspective, the reason this is so enticing as a potential network to develop is because there are a lot of shared ecological factors in these different parts of the world. Yes, yet they have completely different communities. And so it will help me reach my goal of trying to do this kind of research on a platform that forces me to generalize. But then I also have to realize, and right now we're just in the exploration phase where we have money to bring together this big group of people just to talk. And so going into it, I have to realize that at the end of the day, we may not end up with the same goals, and we may or may not be able to put together a network, if that makes sense. And that there are two really different groups. Once again, there's the butterfly monitoring networks, which often have different goals from the local academic institutions who might be wanting to take those data and do research. And so the question is, are we going to be able to bring these people together and find enough of a shared mission that it's actually worth it to develop this network of networks? And then even from my own standpoint, I have to ask, do I want to lead another network? Because this takes a ton of time and energy, and it's time and energy that is often not appreciated by the administrators or my colleagues in my department. So here are some of the characteristics that were already mentioned, and what I was going to do was go through and just sort of give you some vignettes of experiences I have that touch on each one of these factors. And after listening to the morning session, I'm going to try to focus in on a few key sort of issues that I think came up. So first of all is engagement has to be integral to the success of activities. And right here is a really tiny screenshot of our main platform that we ended up building that all these different butterfly monitoring groups use to manage their data. And the fact that they all manage their data on a shared network has not, and it's free, has not only freed them up to do more recruitment and quality control, but many new networks have come online since we've developed this network. I realized that if we were going to do this, we had to get everyone on the same page because we couldn't create 10 systems, we could only create one system. And, by bringing everyone together and realizing that the one thing that people were not going to budge on was the taxonomic authority, we were able to take that into account from day one and build something that works for everybody. And so that's been super successful. One thing I just wanted to bring up about the group in Europe, which I've also worked really closely with, is it's really interesting to see how the cultural boundaries in Europe actually ended up being stronger than here in the US. And it ended up being sort of a reflection of the fact that these are different countries, as opposed to us where we're in different states. And it was kind of funny the way each person from the various butterfly monitoring groups kind of reflected the stereotypes of their country, including me. I was like the loudest person there. But, you realize that even amongst a bunch of European butterfly monitoring networks, there were a lot of really interesting cultural divides. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to talk about this again. So I want to talk a little bit more about the butterfly monitoring network and why I think that's been so successful. So again, we had this foundational meeting in 2012 right here. As a group, we came up with these 6 goals. And these 6 goals are still our goals. And some of them we've met really, really well, and others are still aspirational. And I still feel like all the people who are part of this growing network are still on board with these particular goals. And that everybody in this network benefits from all of this. And that is what has made working with this network the easiest network I work with, and the most successful, and also the most joyful. Like, I love our meetings. I love everybody in it. It's because our interests align really, really closely. Now, I work in other networks where our interests do not align so closely, but that doesn't mean those networks don't work. It just means it's harder. It's harder to make it work, and you really have to have everybody's interest at heart, I think, to be a successful member of these networks. And again, I'll use the example here. The reason I started this was because I wanted their data. Like, literally, that was the only reason I did it, is because I wanted their data. But if I had gone in with that attitude, it never would have worked. And I had to be truly, truly dedicated to the greater good of what this network would produce for everybody. And if I wasn't going to be prepared to do that, even though the thing that I get measured on is research output, and research output and money brought in, it just wasn't going to be successful. And so, you have to really ask yourself, am I getting into this just to serve myself? Which is fine, like, we serve ourselves when we get into these groups, but you also have to have part of your aspirations, part of your goal to really serve a greater good, or it probably isn't going to work very well. I wanted to talk a little bit about Cubes, which is a network of people who initially started to bring math into the undergraduate curriculum. And I've done a lot myself over the past 10 years of trying to bring data-intensive approaches into the undergraduate biology curriculum. So everyone was like, oh, you should work with cubes and BioQuest because they're bringing math into the undergraduate curriculum. And I would say, this is where the epistemology comes in. I'm like, math is not actually the same as data-intensive processes. Those are two completely different things. So I would go, I went to my first BioQuest meeting right here, and I was like, this doesn't really fit what I'm doing. Then a few years later, they were like, we're finally doing data. Come to our workshop. And I went to the workshop, and I'm like, yeah, you're doing data, but it's not big data. It's just regular old data. So it's still not really fitting. And it's finally just this summer that they finally had a workshop that was focused specifically on data analytics, and what I would consider my role in science is more as a data scientist, and that's the approach we take to research. And so now finally this group that I've been sort of going on the outskirts of for many, many years, all of a sudden things have aligned, and they're like, oh, we're so glad you're here, and you obviously have a lot of experience bringing these kinds of things into the classroom, and even just articulating the difference between what does it mean to bring data versus data science into the classroom. What are the skills you need to be a scientist who collects data versus a scientist who uses pre-existing large data sets to answer questions for which those data were not originally collected. And so finally, I feel like after a lot of many years, this collaboration is finally going to kind of take off. I've already kind of talked about this. You want to leverage those resources for mutual benefit. Honestly, if everyone's not benefiting, it's going to be hard to keep that network together. And the other thing is that especially for me, and this includes me, all of this work gets done, in the margins of people's time. And so that means you have to be very forgiving when people say they're going to do something and don't quite get to it. I wanted to end, this will be said over and over, but face-to-face meetings, super important. I want to say a couple of things about platforms before I end, because this has ended up being a really important factor in how these groups work. And first, I want to reflect something that Margaret said, which is that there are so many platforms out there, and right now Slack is like the big thing, and a lot of these platforms are brilliant and they do a great job, but the reality is that if you're a collaborative researcher, you probably work in several collaborative research groups, and I work in several collaborative research groups, and people just suffer from platform overload. And it doesn't matter how great the platform is and how well it works for you. This is, again, another situation where if you don't get buy-in, just use email and Google Docs. It may not, if you can get everyone to buy in to using Slack or using some other workflow management system, that's great. But if you can't, just realize that you can't force people to be on that system, and it just may not work. But sometimes the system really is key, and so I work on this butterfly net project where we're trying to use the international network of collaborators to extract butterfly traits. And so it took the first 2 years of us fighting about whether or not we wanted to hire web developers to create a system that would work, which is what I wanted to do. And everyone else was just like, that's crazy, I can get my postdoc to do it or my grad student to do it. And I would be like, okay, do it. Get your grad student to do it. Get your postdoc to do it. I could do it myself in 4 hours. Okay, do it. Do it. Put it up there and let's all start using it. And at the end of the day, even though this cost $20,000 and not 4 hours of someone's time, this has been the key to make this particular activity work. And so, you have to think about when you actually need the platforms, and if it is it worth spending the money to get somebody who knows what they're doing? And so I'll end on that kind of note, which is that if you're going to lead a network, you have to realize that you're bringing in all these different actors because they're bringing something in that you can't. You have to be willing to hear their perspectives and not try to just get people to agree with you and sign on to the program that you want to do. And that creating and maintaining networks is a skill in and of itself, and it's an activity that you do. And if you don't enjoy that activity of bringing people together and getting them to work together and finding that right mix of people, then running a network may be something that you end up not enjoying very much. For me, I love my networks, but it is a lot of work. And, so I would just sort of leave people with this idea of don't think it's a shortcut to getting something done that you want to get done. It really is an activity in and of itself that takes a lot of care and love and investment.
So our second speaker is Dr. Jessica Vach, Associate Professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. She's also the Director of the Center for the Advanced Studies of Communities and Information, and Associate Director of the Human Computer Interaction Lab. Her research evaluates the benefits and drawbacks of mediated communication by focusing on the role that social and technical affordances shape interactions online.
So I'm going to talk today about some of my experiences running labs, centers, international collaborations, and networks. I really appreciated Claire's distinction in her talk between groups and networks. And I think it's a very messy, blurry space. So a lot of what I do, I wouldn't necessarily classify as a network, but I think the core of networks is collaboration. And how do you do successful collaboration? I have a lot of experience succeeding and failing at that. So I'm going to share some of both of those today. A little bit of background on myself. Already heard the main thing. I'm over at the University of Maryland, just down the street. I'm in an iSchool. College of Information Studies is known as an iSchool. Lots of people have no idea what an iSchool is. iSchools are interdisciplinary programs. A lot of them emerged out of library science. But what they're really focused on is the important research questions at the intersection of information, people, and technology. And so with that, we draw people from all kinds of disciplinary backgrounds. So, for example, I'm a social scientist by training. We have, I'm from communication as my PhD. We have people from psychology, sociology. We have English, education, computer science, engineering. All of these people who, if in a traditional disciplinary system, probably would never talk. We've all come together and we make it work. And iSchools across the U.S. work by figuring out what works for them. I really appreciate the interdisciplinarity because the types of research that I do are not discipline specific. And when you have those types of problems, you need people with different perspectives, people bringing different theories, different methods, all of that. So I am here because I have a lot of experience with different types of centers and labs. I'm going to talk both about Caskey and the HCIL. I also manage it's a very informal network of people who do research on what we call networked privacy in the 21st century, when it's digital, when it's reliant not just on you, but also on other people and on the systems themselves. That's probably around 100 people around the world who are in that network. And then I've done international research on NSF-funded projects, and I am going to talk about one of my other NSF grants that involves very complex collaboration. Leslie showed this slide, so I'm going to skip by this, but I'm going to do a similar approach to what she did, really kind of taking some of these characteristics of networks and breaking them out and giving my own experiences and how that works or doesn't work. So, okay, I already mentioned Caskey and HCIL. Purveyed is an NSF large grant that myself and 6 others received 2 years ago. So these are $3 million, 5-year projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we're 7 people from 6 institutions working on issues around pervasive data. And then the network privacy listserv I already mentioned. So let me go through these a little bit. Caskey is a interdisciplinary group that is within an interdisciplinary department at Maryland, and I've included the mission statement here. You don't necessarily need to read that, but it's a lot about information and organization, broadly conceived. And so what we find is that every week, every Tuesday, we hold either we bring somebody in to give a talk, or we do a reading. And people who are in Caskey suggest readings, and those readings are often outside of your home discipline because they're reflecting that person. So the reading groups provide a great opportunity for us to get to learn about what people who are doing similar research but from a different perspective are talking about. And we find that we get all kinds of folks from around campus who are involved in Caskey, including things like environmental science, geographical sciences, life sciences, as well as kind of the players you would expect with a group like this. We try to do a lot of cross-campus networking. One of the challenges, I think, both in academia and in industry is how do you get people who are in different departments, who are working in different spaces to talk to each other, to have this kind of serendipitous, oh, wow, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. And so Caskey is providing one avenue for folks to do that who are doing similar research. The Human-Computer Interaction Lab, HCI, our HCIL is the oldest human-computer interaction lab in the country. Let's see here. We just had our 36-year anniversary this year, so we were established in the early 80s, and we've been doing some of the really important HCI research. The lab it's a lab. It's called a lab. I don't know if other people have experienced this. There's this huge debate at Maryland about whether you're a center or a lab or, all these other names for things. I think we're more than a lab, but we're not a center. Anyway, seriously, these titles just get in the way. Caskey is definitely not a center according to the university, yet it has center in the name. So if you're not familiar with HCI research, what that's really centered on is how do we improve the way people interact with technology, user-centered design, user experience, those types of things. One of the coolest things I think about the HCIL, and this is probably on another slide, is that, again, we've been around for well over 30 years, so we've had hundreds of students go through who worked with the HCIL. And a great example of how our influence has spread is we have a subset of the HCIL called Kids Team. Kids Team has existed for 21 years. Every year they bring in a group of between 5 and 10 kids who are ages 8 to 11, and they come in twice a week during the school year, and then there's a 2-week summer camp. And what they're doing is they're working on design for products targeted at kids. So a really popular example was when Nickelodeon was remodeling its website. They came to us and they worked with the kids about what that design would be. Well, folks who worked on Kids Team when they were PhD students then went and got jobs, and now there are Kids Team locations at the University of Baltimore and the University of Washington, and they're all doing great research as well. And what this is really focused on is transforming the idea that if you're building toys for kids or building websites for kids or other things for kids that you know best. Well, maybe you should get kids insights. And this idea of co-design was just not something that was really practiced much before the 1990s, especially when it was with children, because better than children was the prevailing attitude. And so this is really force people to recognize that kids do have valuable insights when it comes to figuring out what's going to work and not work for them. So I'm going to talk about some more specific examples, but again, we meet every week in person, the whole lab. We find that when we provide free lunch, more people show up, shockingly enough. We can have about 50 to 60 people most weeks coming to this. I'll probably talk more about the annual symposium, and we do a lot of alumni and social events because this is a large network of both current and former folks who are working with the lab. With Purveyed came together a few years ago, emerging out of what I would say another network, CSST, which, Steve, Consortium for the Study of Socio-Technical? Science of Socio-Technical, which is yes. which is an amazing group of folks, and this grant proposal emerged out of that. And we think of it as a collaboratory. So it's this idea there's 7 of us, 6 institutions at 7 different places around the U.S., and somehow we managed to get a lot of work done. Again, this goes back to like if you don't have dedicated resources to just organizing and managing things, this would never have happened because you can't rely on me to be the person to be organizing this stuff. I have too much other stuff going on. But I'll give some examples of how that's working. And then I really already mentioned this. The big thing with this group of privacy researchers is we've been forming and evolving over the last decade, and a lot of this is due to the fact that at least once a year we have a workshop at one of the major conferences. There's maybe 5 conferences that we've done workshops at that are on various topics related to network privacy, and that's allowed the network to grow. That's allowed the folks who maybe were more junior early on to take more senior positions as organizers of workshops to push what they want to be talked about. It's allowed us to have these 1 or 2 days every year where we're really focusing narrowly in on specific aspects of privacy research. So, what direction is it going in the next 10 years? What's the relationship between networked privacy and ethics? How do you measure privacy when you're doing research? That's some of the examples that we have done with this group. So in terms of lessons learned, one of the challenges that we have had with some of these groups is around making sure that you have clearly articulated goals and mission statement. I'm a little jealous, Leslie, of those 6 goals that you say you came up with in 2012 and still hold today. This is something that, for example, with Caskey, which is something where I'm doing this, I'm the director, I'm doing this all in my own free time. I have very limited resources to spend in thinking about how to grow Caskey. Whenever I do, I say, yeah, there's all these things I would love to do if I had the time. But, we have this very generic mission statement of what our goals are, and to me that detracts from our ability to grow because we haven't kind of carved out the specific things that we want to accomplish. Right now we're kind of in this stasis where we provide a time and a space to bring people together to talk, and I'm not going to lie, that's a great thing to do, but if we wanted to grow, if we wanted to expand beyond campus, if we wanted to have more of an impact, I think one of the very first things we would need to do is revisit this and figure out what contribution can we be making, do we want to make, what do we need to make those contributions. And maybe when I'm, back from sabbatical next year, I'll take that on. But again, when you're an academic and you're not necessarily getting credit for these things, it really has to be a labor of love. It often has to take the back seat, and that's a challenge in academia in general. So a second lesson that I have found is that it's one thing to start building a network and have a bunch of buy-in in the beginning, but if you want those people to keep coming back, if you want them to keep contributing, if you want that network to grow, you need to have some kind of value add for the folks who belong in it. So to give you an example with this networked privacy group, one of the value adds is this community and this sense of community for folks who come to these workshops every year, but there's not much to be offered other than this information sharing. So we have a listserv, we have a Facebook page where people can share information, very low cost. It's not something that they're putting on their CV. So I'm always also thinking about, well, what can we do to provide more value to these people beyond informational value? When we think about what could constitute value, one of them is prestige. And I would say prestige is something with the HCIL that is a big value add to it. HCIL is really interesting, and we have debates about this every few years about the structure of it, because there's the HCIL, but then most faculty in the HCIL have their own labs. And so we're all umbrellaed under the HCIL, but we're all doing different research. And so we're thinking of how do we want to try to connect all of these different labs in more meaningful ways, or is it enough that we just have the HIL as a venue in which we're sharing our own research? And we've never really been able to come to a conclusion as to whether some better way of doing this that makes our different research more interconnected. But there is a lot of prestige with being in the oldest HCI lab in the country, and that brings us money, that brings us attention, that brings us students, all those kinds of things. Informational opportunities like updates, funding, those types of things could be a value add. Again, that's kind of low. The networking or forming friendships or identifying collaborators, I think, is a big value add, especially if there aren't people in your own department, in your own area who are doing research. So a lot of the folks that I collaborate with don't have natural collaborators in their home department. And so these types of spaces and venues provide a really good opportunity for doing that. As Leslie said, again, I was a communication undergrad, so I know all about, the importance of communication and face-to-face communication. With Purveyed, for example, we, we're at 7 different locations. We try to meet up twice a year in person for some sort of 2-day event. Oftentimes one of those is at a conference, and then one of them might be in one of the collaborators' home spaces. And we get so much done in these 2 days, but we're also really forging those relationships with our collaborators. And when you like somebody, it's much easier to work with them. When you know somebody, it's much easier to work with them in general. So doing that type of collaboration, that type of face-to-face interaction is going to really bring cohesion. This picture on the right for you is from the HCIL. Every year we go to CHI, Computer Human Interaction Conference, which is, 4,000 person conference. And every year they do this big picture. They ask folks to wear green shirts. They ask alumni to come. And so literally just taking the 10 minutes to do this group photo makes people feel like they are a member of that group. And I think it keeps that connection going. Another lesson, and I'm not sure if this is the last one, I think I have one more after this. Interdisciplinary problems require interdisciplinary solutions. This is obvious, but again, something that I assume is going to happen that maybe in your own research in your own spaces is not a guarantee, is that the research I'm doing is not specific to a discipline, and the research groups that I'm in, the centers that I'm in, the collaborations I do, by nature, have to be interdisciplinary. They would not succeed. I do think one of the big reasons that the NSF funded us with this Purveyed large grant was that the 7 of us are very interdisciplinary. This idea of data ethics and the challenges around data ethics in the modern age is one that requires lots of different approaches to the problem. And so by bringing these people together, we were able to do it. This is an example of some of the different folks represented in the HCIL. International collaborations are really challenging. I have not been involved in an international network, but I have been involved in international collaborations. And there are just lots of things that you need to think of. So I do privacy research. If you're not familiar with it, Europe has a very different attitude toward consumer privacy than the US. And so navigating that is an interesting research question in and of itself. But when you're trying to figure out literally just things like, where can we put the files? Can we put them on Dropbox? Oh, EU won't let us share that kind of data, simple logistics like that. Just how you get incentivized, and I mean that in terms of the researchers. If you're on the tenure track or the equivalent, what do you need to do to get promoted, and does that match up? Language barriers, obviously. Different challenges, different policies. For us, the policy differences has been both fascinating and difficult. It's also really hard to coordinate funding across 2 different countries. So with the grant that I'm referring to, it was a collaboration between the NSF and the NVO, which is the equivalent of the NSF in the Netherlands, and they both reviewed it and they both gave us grants. The thing that is unfortunate is that they were 2-year grants on the US side, they were 4-year grants on the Netherlands side, and now that we're done that, there's no mechanism for us to easily put in to continue that research together. So we need to submit separately and hope that we both get funded and then figure out ways to match up again. So that opportunity was amazing. the sustainability problem of guaranteeing funding or providing funding across multiple countries is really hard. And then finally, again, also obvious, so I'll end here with, just having a project manager, somebody whose primary job is to be making sure everything is running right. In academia, especially, is the only way that things are going to work. On the Purveyed grant, we're very happy to have a full-time project manager, and I don't think we would be getting half of what we were getting done if we didn't have her. Yes, it's just you need to have somebody who that's their primary responsibility. Like Leslie said, if people are doing something and they're busy with lots of other things, things are going to slip through, things aren't going to work. And so making sure you're budgeting for that. And I know in the AccelNet proposals, that is a big part of it, is funding for this type of thing. So yes, that should be taken as a given already. But just from my own personal experience, you'll either fail or you'll be at a glacial pace if you don't have people who are being paid to be doing just that.
So now we can open the floor to questions. I think we have the mic over here.
I just really want to continue to sing the praises of having project management. I'm on the NIH side of life, and certainly it's much more accepted in that culture that now when we are reviewing proposals, if people don't actually explicitly list project management for the larger scoped proposals, that will very negatively impact our view of the project. So it's refreshing to hear that in other domains it's important, and I think NIH might really serve as a pretty good model for recognizing the importance of that. With the other thing, another dimension of that's happening with one project that I'm involved with, it's a multi-PI consortium. Every one of those PIs has somebody who is designated as a project manager. And NIH, the funding office that we have many interactions with, they also are recognizing that they need project management. And what happens is that this information kind of percolates up, where you could have essentially several different scrums that are doing different types of development, and you're passing that information up to them, and then you're passing it to the funding agent. And for us, what's absolutely essential about that is on the NIH side, there's a whole bunch of policy development that we're highly dependent on that as an academic I have no control over. And so I can contact I'm on a daily communication basis on Slack with the project manager at the NIH side, and her official job is to be receiving when I highlight that there's a really big risk to the project, and then she really tracks down trying to do something with respect to the administrative development that needs to be accompanied with it. So that was not a question. I apologize, but does that resonate for you?
Say you're applying for an NSF small, that's $500,000. Your university is taking over half of that. So basically you have enough money for a student and some of the research costs and maybe a month of summer salary. And people might say, well, my student can be that. The student should never be the project manager. I mean, they're there to be trained as research, not project management. And they're not going to come with those skills, and then you're just going to, I feel like it's going to create more work. So people, I feel the pinch, especially in the smaller NSF grants, that there's just no way we could do it. But yeah, it never works out. So I never even ask the students, then I'm the one who just has to do all of that, because I don't want them to be doing all of the IRB requests and money processing and stuff like that. But yeah, and the only reason we made it a priority in this, recognizing it was big, and we had $3 million to work with, which doesn't happen too often.
I want to echo some of the things you were saying, and repeat something I had said earlier, which is that I feel like in my field, there is this real pushback against building money in for, administrative tasks that I'm usually the person who's arguing, no, we should all give summer salary to ourselves because we've got to honor what we're doing. And, I can't tell you how many times when I've talked to people about, I'm struggling with this and struggling with that, they always say, well, why don't you get your grad students or postdocs to do that? And I don't have the energy to even explain to you why that is such a bad idea.
Either that or like all PhD students need to take like a web design course because they're all building our websites.
Yeah.
We're asking them all to do that.
And so it's hard because, again, there's not a lot of respect, I think, built in for just sheer administrative work of keeping these networks together.
I would like to ask you to comment on what I see as a paradox. So you mentioned that since this is happening on the margins of people's time, and so one has to be forgiven in terms of deliverables, right? If somebody missed a deadline or something like that. But earlier on, we heard that accountability, it's important. And ideally, you have to, schedule when things have to happen and who has to take care of them. So how do you reconcile those two things?
You have to decide what your priorities are, and if you need deliverables to be delivered, then you need to give the person the resources to do that. And often that's what we don't have. And we're asking people to donate their time, basically, to a cause that they may believe in. But if they're donating their time and we're not actually offering them the resources of our network, if they don't deliver, then you have to accept that. And if you want them to deliver, you have to make sure you're providing the resources. And so I would say you have to be forgiving to other people and also to yourself. I feel a tremendous amount of guilt for the things that I've said I'm going to do and end up not getting to. But it's true that some things you need to accomplish. Make sure you have the resources to do it.
I'd like to share the project manager, project director. I mean, we have a full-time project director, we have a full-time project manager, and I have the same guilt because we don't feel like we get it all done either, and we sort of pretty much manage as a partnership. So we've got separate things, we've got things that we decide together, and we talk every single day, multiple times on the phone. Our project manager's in California, I'm in Florida, and I have found that the National Science Foundation is really oriented toward project managers to make sure these projects run smoothly. And a number of our major networks who have joined through ADBC funding into what we do, the first networks, it was like, we can handle this. This can't be too hard. The later networks are now saying, no, we've got to have a project manager. And the folks early in the process of funding are telling the later ones in the process of funding, first thing you need to do is put in a project manager because this is way bigger than you can possibly imagine.
I'm also going to say that, so I'm working on two big collaborative projects right now, and one of them we put a ton of thought into our project management plan, and the other one I would say not so much. And we don't have an official project manager, but for that one group where we really put a lot of thought into that project management plan, we constantly go back to that project management plan. And when we're like, we're not sure what to do next, we're like, hey, let's go look at our project management plan. Even though we wrote it 4 years ago, it still has been a valuable tool for us to move our project forward.
So if your dean or department head came and said, you can have more money or more time, for you, which would you take?
It's such a cop-out to say both, but I have to say, for me, if I have money, I have a great team that is really, really research productive, and if all I'm doing is facilitating their research, I feel like I'm getting a lot done. I'll take the money and make the time, as long as I can use it for my research team.
I was going to say time, but yeah, money can buy you time.
Yeah.
So definitely money.
I wonder if each of you could just talk briefly about, for one of your networks, the very beginning stages. And I understand how you can reach out to people you already know, but to pull in a broader community, how did you do that?
So I wasn't around for the beginning of several of them. So I guess I would have to go to the Privacy Researcher Network, and we had run the workshop a couple times, a couple different years, and we're like, well, there's actually a lot of folks interested in this who aren't getting to participate in every workshop. They're not seeing or hearing everything that we're doing. And so we need to think about ways to both make the content that's being generated from these conversations more widely available, but provide more opportunities for all folks who are doing this kind of research to be a part of the conversation, to be able to provide feedback. I mean, we are a relatively small group. I mean, it's 80 to 100 people. But we're all kind of joined together by this, focal point on trying to understand the privacy issues that are driving us into the mid part of the 21st century. And so it was really just the kind of core group of us just having a lot of conversations about what are the best ways to make sure that everybody has a voice in these conversations, everybody has access to materials, and especially younger PhD students who might be thinking about this. How do we get them involved? How do we make them feel like their voices, their opinions matter? And so I mean it's a very slow moving process, again, because I get nothing from doing this other than like the benefit of connecting people. Like it helps my career in no way to do this. And so yes, it is very slow. I do think that it has been useful, and maybe in another 5 to 10 years we'll be more structured and better able to grow. But so it was the way that workshops in my the conferences that I go to is usually folks. You have an organizing committee that's usually 5 to 8 people who propose the workshop, get that accepted, and then there's an open call for people to submit position papers. And so this had run, I believe the first one I went to was the 3rd time it had run. And by the 4th time it had run, we were like, okay, we're on to something here. Like, they keep accepting these workshops, so they must think it's important. People keep coming to these, both new and returning people. So there's still lots of people interested. Maybe we should think about ways to go expand beyond just having a workshop every year at one of the main conferences that folks who are in social computing, human-computer interaction, those types of spaces, information science are attending.
One thing I would say is that if you are trying to build a true network of networks, then hopefully if you're the lead person, you're more working with the lead of each network, because it can be overwhelming working with a ton of people. Now, having said that, one thing I do is, I'm very much a people person. I am very cognizant of people's personalities. And I try not to get into collaborations with people who seem like they're not going to be good collaborators. Now, sometimes that's impossible. But for the most part, I have a network of people that I know who know me. And when they say, Leslie, you should work with this person, that is a great lead for me. Because it is the group of personalities that make it work out. But on the other hand, if it's really big, you can't control everybody. But when a group has a good leader, that makes a huge difference. So if there's one person who's kind of a pain in the neck to deal with, just make sure that's not the leader. So I think just really, thinking about the team and whether or not people work well together.
So as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm finding myself wondering, where are the common areas between the types of networks that you've outlined in your 2 talks and professional societies, which I feel like offer maybe a parallel structure. So how has your experience in your networks of networks met needs that professional societies don't already meet? And what opportunities for sort of leveraging these 2 types of parallel structures could you envision?
To me, they're so different. Like, the professional societies are, so big and sprawling, and they meet the needs of the research community, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm working directly with those people. Like, with all the networks of networks, we have much more specific shared goals, and trying to produce something, whether it's a paper or a website or whatever it is, that is an actual deliverable, something tangible that we all have some ownership in. And I know that's something that professional societies do, but it's just it's much more tailored for, I guess, a very specific outcome.
So none of mine are networks of networks, just to be clear. They're networks or groups or, other things, but none of the things that I'm involved in are networks of networks. I think Leslie has some very clear examples of that. I would say one of the biggest things that I have noticed is that participation in these different types of groups has given us new opportunities to push for issues that are important to us. So within the ACM community, Association of Computing Machinery, and specifically SIGCHI, which is where the I don't know if I mentioned both, but anyway, two of the major conferences in social computing are based out of. At around the same time that this Purveyed project was really getting underway, we saw two of our PIs who were part of a new unit specifically focused on ethics in big data type research. And so in our community, lots of people are scraping websites, lots of people are, doing all kinds of things that are in the ethically gray area. And so folks who are on this Purveyed grant were able to have a big contribution to how that committee was set up in the larger ACM community and the types of directions that they're going. We've also been running town halls at a lot of these conferences every year to have conversations about ethics and research. It's a very hot topic, and it's very heated in our communities. People, again, a lot of this goes back to what discipline you're coming from, and not to stereotype, but a lot of times you'll see computer scientists who are just trying to build the best system, and so they're not necessarily recognizing that humans are on the ends of those data points, and the social scientists, meanwhile, are like, no, you need to think about consent and harm and all these other things. They are real people. So, we can have some really great debates, which is what we want. We want to have those conversations with the wider community, but just the grant and some of the attention around the grant and our ability to kind of take that and convert it into these larger discussions in the research community, I think has been really beneficial.
I was talking with someone about this earlier I love going to the annual conferences of, the professional societies I'm in, but my time is limited, and I've just found over the past few years that I don't want to travel so much, and I find myself more going to collaborative meetings because those face-to-face meetings are so important rather than going to the annual conferences, even though I get something entirely different and important out of those annual conferences. And at this point, I'm sort of glad I have a lab where I'm like my postdocs and grad students are going to those conferences because I just feel like I need to be at the PI meetings, and I can't be traveling all the time.
I don't have a question, but just an observation. And Jessica, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I was an early member of a mid-level member of HCIL. And what I found was so valuable about that experience is in establishing a culture. And so I will also say that I did end up collaborating with at least 3 of the different faculty members on different projects, and that culture setting was critical. So one of the first things that happened when I first joined the lab was a student from some other research project came in and showed up at one of our project meetings and sat down and said, I'm really interested in what you all are doing. Can I sit in and learn about what you're doing? And I think because HCIL is inherently interdisciplinary and there is this culture of openness and sharing, at least of information, it basically set the rules in such a way that interdisciplinary work was much more possible, and also team projects, team science was more possible. And so as members of HCIL now have gone out into the world, I imagine that if the research were to be done, that they are all much more team-oriented and collaborative than your typical effort like that.
There are a couple of things I didn't talk about with HCIL. One thing we do at the start of every semester is we have on our first day kind of like an introduction sharing session where everybody, and it's a lot more students and faculty, go around and just say what their research interests are. And a part of that is literally to help identify, who's doing what research, and, that you can go talk to that person if you're interested in that. Another thing we do every year is we have an annual symposium in which we're spending a day showcasing all of the work that's been happening in the HCIL, and it's open to the public, and we usually have about 300 attendees, but it's also great for people in the HCIL to be learning about the research that everybody else is doing. I will say that we tend to, one of the main missions is literally sharing and promoting what folks are doing. So there is a lot of, there's never this research is more important or inherently better than other research. And just one example of HCIL facilitated collaboration for myself is through the lab and through Kids Team, I am working with another faculty member from education originally and a computer scientist we had Google funding, and now we just put in an NSF proposal to look at how to build privacy and security education into elementary school curriculum. And, just the three of us might never have talked, otherwise. But through the lab and through, these conversations and other types of activities, we were like, oh, yeah, we could put something together that satisfies all three of the types of questions we're asking.